Today we're joined by Radware, and we're going to be discussing IoT, botnets, and DDoS threats. So definitely some scary stuff out there with all these new threats. But luckily today we have a great group of guests joining today's panel to dive into this and more. So first off, he's a returning face, very active user in the Spiceworks community. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Gary Williams. Gary, can you tell the folks a little bit about yourself?
Hey everyone, my name's Gary Williams. I'm IT infrastructure team lead for a company called Genius Sports that's based in central London. So for that job role, I look after all the servers, the VMware, the storage, and we've just recently acquired a bunch of IoT cameras, so I get the fun of looking after those as well, and pretty much anything else that might have a plug on it.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Gary. And I heard your cat may or may not be making an appearance today.
Yeah, there's a good chance that my trusty assistant may be appearing shortly. She's just playing downstairs at the moment.
All right, well, we'll wait for some IoT cat toys, and then maybe we can get her on the panel as well. Awesome. Well, also joining us from Radware, we have Pascal Jeanins. So Pascal, welcome, and can you tell the folks a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Matt. Happy to be here, and thank you everyone for joining and taking the time for listening in. I'm the EMEA security evangelist for Radware. So in terms of my day-to-day, that means that I'm keeping track of the threat landscapes, also part of the security research team, do public speaking. I produce content on anything that is relating to our product portfolio, but not specific for the product portfolio. So for the people who wouldn't know, Radware is a global provider of security products and services. We ensure the availability and security for digital and online applications. Our portfolio includes application delivery control, web application firewalls, DDoS protection, either in physical and virtual form factor, and also built into solutions for data centers, cloud providers, and cloud native applications.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining today, Pascal. Really looking forward to hearing some of the great information that you have for our audience today. Well, real quick, if y'all don't know me, I'm Matt Ituri here at Spiceworks. I'm usually behind the scenes on the air and many of our other live events. So Justin cannot join us today, so I get to take his place and hopefully do a great job hosting today's event. So looking forward to seeing how I do as well. But yeah, moving on here. I did want to give everyone a quick rundown of the console and the different widgets you're seeing around our faces here. So off to the right, if you don't see the chat window already, you're welcome to pop that open using some of those orange at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead, pop open chat, say hello to everyone in there. We do want to let you know that the chat here does follow the Spiceworks community guidelines. So please keep it professional. But yeah, let's keep it spicy. This is Spiceworks. So definitely say hi to everyone in there. But if chat is not for you, please feel free to close that out and just focus in on the conversation. To the bottom of the window there, you'll see the Q&A. As we go through today's discussion, please feel free to get your questions as we go along. We'll be asking our panel those questions a little further in the show. Off to the right, you'll see some quick bios of today's panelists, as well as below that, some awesome resources, handouts that Radware has made available for you guys to download and check out. Well, cool. Well, without any further ado, all the housekeeping's out of the way. Let's jump into this conversation. IoT devices have definitely are new to a lot of people, though they've been around for a little bit of a while. So first question to Pascal, easy targets.
Yeah, so I think most of the audience will have a good idea of what we mean when we say that IoT is vulnerable. There's different classes of IoT devices out there, going from children toys to pacemakers to all the devices that we as IT people and geeks have around us, like IP cameras and DVRs, routers, even modems. They used to call routers or modems, but now they're all called IoT devices. So, and especially from our point of view, looking at the threat landscape for DDoS attacks, we're interested in those devices that can fall victim to IoT botnets. And those devices all have a common thread, and that is they are running an embedded version of a very familiar operating system, which is Linux. Everybody has access to Linux. Everybody has access to tool chains on Linux to compile applications and compile them in a cross-platform way. So they can cross-compile applications for different architectures like ARMS and MIPS and x86, typically what we see in those IoT devices as platforms. Now, at the same time, those platforms are resource constrained. So they have stripped down operating environment, and not stripped down in the order for hardening it, but more in the kind of manner that they stripped it down because they are reduced on processing power. So there's less room for security features. Nonetheless, they are powerful enough to perform some very good attacks, knowing that an IP camera can spit out images and compress those images. You have enough power there and enough headroom to perform attacks. Now, another thing about those devices is that typically they are unmanned. So it's not like a user is sitting behind a console or logging onto that device and checking every day to see what happened in the logs, if somebody came on the device or there was a strange pop-up from the device. So typically users will not even be aware that their device has been infected and being abused to perform other tasks than just recording images. And then there's also the market. So to save engineering time, because we're talking about a market that goes to consumers, so there's a big pressure on margins. And to save engineering times, manufacturers typically reuse portions of hardware and software from different upstream manufacturers, which means if an upstream manufacturer put in a default password or had a vulnerability, that vulnerability gets copied to different devices from downstream manufacturers. So you will see it come back in different classes and also different names of devices. Now, a common joke in IoT is that we say that the S in IoT stands for security. So I think that covers it all.
Awesome. And Gary, what experience do you have with IoT devices in your organization?
Well, just recently we've installed some security cameras that's in the data center, that's in the offices, places like that. Now, these are your typical black box IoT devices. We got told by the manufacturer, you just plug them in, put them on your Wi-Fi, and that's it. You leave them alone. You don't need to touch them. They'll look after themselves. But me being me, I did some digging into these devices and found that they're running an old version of Raspberry Pi variant of Linux. And quick 2 seconds on Google, I think it was, and yes, there's vulnerabilities there. Asked the manufacturer about updating them, and they seemed a little bit shocked. Update them? They're black box devices. You don't need to do this. They're fine. They're just cameras. So that was something of an eye opener. And when you think about, you've got all these apps on your smartphone, and smartphones now with bring your own device type things, you've got these apps that connect to IoT devices. You start to wonder just how secure are these things? How secure is the communication from that smartphone to the IoT device? And potentially, what else could this stuff be exposing?
Yeah, for sure. And Pascal, I mean, these devices that Gary has, they're obviously newer devices, but running an old operating system. What are manufacturers doing to get better about security and keep up with these threats?
Well, for sure, I have to say that manufacturer came a long way in securing their devices, but still, we have lots of devices out there that are vulnerable, and that is a problem that will not be solved overnight. If you think about the attacks that happened in October 2016, so the DDoS attacks on Dyn, OVH, and Krebs, which was not the first IoT botnet, so it was Mirai, but it was not the first IoT botnet, but the first IoT botnet to actually create an event that was talked about by the whole community and that impacted very important services. Those botnets were actually using a very easy attack vector, which is using default passwords. So default passwords, those are the kind of passwords that you find if you ever open the manual So for example, typically when you go into the web interface, you create an admin user, create a strong password, and then in that web interface, you can change some parameters of your device. But as we are IT professionals, we like to change a little bit more in the device. So we want to find some certain commands from the CLI. So when you go digging into the manual, and you look at the back, you will find that there is a CLI access, and that access happens through Telnet, and it's using a default password like admin or root123456. If you don't find it in the admin guide, or if there is no admin guide to start with, you will be able to find it in the forums. So go to the forums and you will find that there are default passwords that most of the time cannot even be changed because those devices are running on from a read-only file system. So those passwords sometimes are hard to change. Now, Mirai, just with a default dictionary of 61 credentials, was able to enslave hundreds of thousands of devices around the internet. So just by using default password, just by using Telnet, connecting directly to those devices, which means that those devices are unprotected on the internet and had default passwords that were be able to use by a botnet to enslave them. Now, after Mirai, so a lot of people got aware of those default credentials, started closing Telnet, okay, but attackers they move to another kind of vulnerability. And soon after Mirai, we saw attacks like, for example, the Deutsche Telekom attack by a hacker that went by the name by Best Buy. He just took a vulnerability that was in the admin interface and used that vulnerability to produce remote command execution. So he inserted a command there to download the bot. And as you know, if you do an RCE, remote command execution, on a admin interface, that admin interface will be running with privileged users. So you get pretty much access to the whole operating system. So because of that, we know that manufacturers, even though that they try to secure their devices, they're still humans that are building the admin interfaces and the software. So they tend to make errors. They're just human. Now, it's important that we can update those devices whenever there's a vulnerability found, because if in the cybersecurity, when we see a report coming out of a new vulnerability that has been disclosed to a manufacturer like a couple of weeks before, has been patched and the fix being available, as soon as the POC comes out and is disclosed to the public, 24 hours later, we see attackers abusing that vulnerability and trying to enslave devices. Now, why would they do that? Because the fix is out there. Well, actually, even the fix being out there doesn't mean that users are updating their devices. We're talking consumers here. So even in the professional worlds, it's not a fact that the updates happen 24 hours or within the window of 24 hours, let alone with consumers. So it's typical to see vulnerabilities being abused for things that have been published like 3-4 years ago. You see that happening quite regularly, actually.
Right. No, totally. And Gary, what are some best practices that you maybe would recommend around not only, as Pascal pointed out, updating your admin passwords on your devices, but also just making sure that they're secure and not going to be vulnerable?
Oh, it's the same for a lot of devices. So with these sort of things, it's always good to put them onto their own VLAN, put a firewall between them and everything else. Make sure that firewall has only the rules it must have to transfer the traffic that it needs to transfer. If you can't harden the device, this becomes even more important. If you can get intrusion detection, intrusion prevention, all that kind of stuff. And if you can put some sort of logging on there to see what is hitting it, what is trying to hit it. As Pascal said, 24 hours after an attack is made public, you are going to see this stuff hitting firewalls. The reason for that is the attackers out there have automation down to a very fine art. People talk about DevOps and automation. These hackers have been doing this stuff for years. So it's really important to also subscribe to various security notifications, see what's out there. Just do a Google search for the device and see if anyone's come across anything. And then put, say, VLANs, things like that in the way, put ACLs in the way. Sometimes it's not possible to do firmware updates on them, so just put in the way what you can to make these devices as locked down, as secure, as hidden as possible. As the example of the cameras we have at work, we put them on secured VLANs. We can't remove them. I would love to remove them and try firmware updates on them and things like that. But like a lot of companies, it's a little bit political, so they have to be there for various reasons. So we've just put them on an isolated network. We've got all these firewall rules in place. We've only opened up the stuff that we need to open, and we have the firewall syslogging out to a log server with alarms and things like that. Could we miss something? Absolutely. But if we see something that looks suspicious, then we can put more logging around that, more digging, so on and so forth. It can be a losing battle at times, but it's one of those things, unfortunately, with the threat landscapes we have today, you just have to do.
Yeah, totally. No, there's definitely some great recommendations there. And Pascal, I mean, we have these devices on our networks. Obviously, the hackers and perpetrators are trying to get in. So how fast can these devices be discovered, and how exactly, what tools are these hackers using to find these devices and then exploit them?
Yeah, there's actually different ways. The most convenient way, and also for people who are listening in, most convenient way to find devices or to find vulnerabilities within a family of devices is to use what we call the IoT search engines like Shodan.io or Zoomeye or Census. If you go to those are like the Google of IoT devices. What those search engines do is continuously scanning the internet. And I'm talking about all the IP addresses that typically are not indexed by Google because they're not running a web server or any content, but they are just scanning the internet for all IP addresses. And they are collecting banners, like they connect to Telnet, they scrape the banner, they connect on SSH, scrape the banner, they connect to the web server, then they know the web server name. So they are indexing a lot of information. And if you have a vulnerability, for example, if you know that Dropbear SSH is very vulnerable, and there have been a couple of vulnerabilities disclosed last year, you just go search for Dropbear and for the version number, and you get a very convenient list of all the devices that you can attack. Now, there's also an API available, so that makes it, and to Gary's point, some of those malicious actors are automated. So they use an API and they just download all the IP addresses and go try to infect them one by one. Now, those are already the more sophisticated one. The original Mirai took another approach and had a more worm-like propagation. And what it did was, once a device is infected, it started scanning for other devices, trying to find devices with Telnet open, because that was its main attack vector that was going in through Telnet, testing 61 default credentials, see if it can get access to it. So every device that got infected, its first job was to be a scanner and detect new victims. And then it would report that to a central server who did the actual infection of the device itself, which just generally means doing a download using a command line client like wget or curl or tftp to just download the binary, execute it. That's all it does as from a loader point of view. But those scanners are distributed, which also brings me to the point and to the reason that I started looking at those IoT botnets with honeypots. And that is that on average, when you listen on any IP address, and that's also at home on your DSL line, when you would listen in, you would see that on average, every 2 minutes, there's a bot trying to infect you. So when you put a honeypot out there, you will see a lot of activity on Telnet port. There's still a lot going on SSH and also on HTTP. Now, coming back to one point that Gary said about firewalling, one important point in firewalling is, and it's less important for enterprises, but especially for consumers, is disable UPnP. It might break your PlayStation or Xbox, yeah, I know, but on the other end, those devices that we're talking about, IP cameras, DVRs, NASs, Bitcoin miners, they're all built for convenience. And UPnP is one of those convenience protocols to make it easy for a user. You just deploy a device internal in your house. Now, the problem is with that device, it's not accessible from the outside world. So we cannot ask a user, go to your firewall or to your router and create a NAT rule that allows incoming traffic to your device. So instead of that, we invented something that's more automatic, which is called universal plug and play. And the device itself can communicate to the router and ask it to open a pinhole in your firewall and allow any traffic from outside. And that is actually how many devices are actually fully exposed to the internet. They are exposing their admin access and their streaming access to the internet to allow mobile devices to from outside the home to get access to the images or to the management.
Yeah, cool. No, definitely. There's some agreement with closing up the UPnP. Definitely a great quick win there, as Aaron Lyons points out. Well, cool. Well, I guess next kind of thing I want to dig into is, all right. So your IoT device has been infected. Um, there is now a botnet on that device. Pascal, what kind of actions are these bots performing, and what is the impact on the owner of that device?
Yeah, so the original IoT botnets back in 2016 were mainly being used for performing DDoS attacks. So in a DDoS attacks, you need many devices to make that attack perform. So that was an important payload vector that we saw in 2016. Now, end of 2017, coming into 2018, we saw that moving to different use cases. One of them, and one that everybody's familiar with, is mining cryptocurrencies. So those devices that are vulnerable out there on the internet, I already said they are resource constrained, but if you can put them in a mining pool and you can gather like 200,000 devices that work together in a mining pool, you can get some cryptocurrencies. Now, other IoT devices, or better devices that we also consider in the world of IoT, is Bitcoin miners themselves. So if you have a Bitcoin miner, and we saw attacks on that, Bitcoin miners themselves also had some vulnerabilities, and they could be infected by an IoT botnet and just in there, just doing some crypto mining. They don't even have to download the software because the software is already there. And the most, well, I would say nicest, not really the nicest, but the best example I would say of such an attack was an actual vulnerability, an unauthenticated administrative access that got somebody to change the wallet address in the miner. So all he did was just send out HTTP strings that were directly changing the wallet address to his own wallet. So that meant that everybody who had one of those crypto miners at home, they were changing, instead of having their wallet, it was another guy's wallet that they were mining for. So it might take you like 24 hours or a week to find out that you don't get anything new in your wallet. But at the same time, that guy gathered from hundreds of thousands of devices into his own personal wallet. So that's a nice attack.
Yeah, definitely. Pretty interesting way that they can leverage these devices so quickly and efficiently. So yeah, Gary, like what have you seen? Obviously, you kind of work in the casino world. Have there been any issues that you've seen with these IoT devices, especially around the Bitcoin mining and that kind of stuff?
We haven't seen anything on them yet. The IoT devices we've got are just these webcams. So far, everything's been good, but we are keeping a close eye on them. But going back a little bit to what Pascal was saying earlier, one thing we have seen is, it's actually a mistake I made about 6 months ago. Took a Linux server, spun it up in the cloud, had port 22 open to the internet, put Logwatch on there, came back, I think it was like 24 hours later, and there is this enormous log file for all these attacks. It's like miles and miles long of all these IP addresses that are just slamming port 22. And it just reinforces what Pascal was saying, that you really need to have a level of logging on there and close those well-known ports, because they will be attacked. And if you've got IoT devices that have these ports open, it's worth doing some checks on them beforehand to make sure that either you're blocking them or doing something else with them if you can't get in there and actually close them on a web console or whatever else they've got.
Yeah, totally. Well, cool. Well, I think next thing to kind of jump into is Pascal. What can businesses do to start protecting against these exploits? We've talked a little about the UPnP and some other things, that ports that we can shut down and things like that. But what are some other methods that we can use to try to combat these threats?
Yeah, well, Gary already touched on this, and the first important point is isolate those devices from your actual network. So put them on a separate VLAN, because once those devices are infected, we're not talking about IoT botnets, but it can also be more advanced attacks. And we have seen recently that there are some organized crime units out there that are using IoT botnets now. So think about VPN Filter, for example, which was a recent botnet that was very sophisticated, and that was built to infect modems, and also to, at the same time, so not only use it for DDoS attacks, but one of the payloads was monitoring SCADA traffic. So SCADA traffic is one point. We saw other IoT modems, like in Brazil. More recently, we found that there was a hacker that found a way to change the DNS settings on modems. So what he did is just through one URL, he could change the primary and secondary DNS. And by doing so, he's actually redirecting all the hosts inside the network to use another DNS server. So what he did is set up a rogue DNS server that forwards all requests to the real DNS servers, except for a couple of banks. So, and for those banks, that meant that those users were redirected to cloned websites that he used to collect information from them. So in terms of what users can do is, first of all, firewall your devices, put them on a separate network. But of course, if it's a modem, there's not much firewalling that you can do, right? It is your firewall. It is your primary access to the internet. So there, the most important thing for me is keep up to date. We saw a lot of talk about MikroTik and how much vulnerabilities they had recently. But all those vulnerabilities, when they were disclosed, they were all fixed. So if you fix soon, and if you fix very closely to whatever is happening, that should be one thing. And it's not only the users, it's also the manufacturers. Manufacturers should have a way to communicate that there's a new update. Preferably, it should happen automatically, but I can understand that people get nervous about automatic updates. Still, even though I get nervous from them, I have them enabled. This is just security. I prefer to have my device go down for a couple of minutes or have an issue because of an automatic update than having a malware in my house that can bring down much more things, especially when they're not on a separate VLAN, because once they're inside, they have free play. They can laterally move to many different operating systems and also different devices.
Yeah, like you said, once one device is infected, it's only a matter of time before everything on that network is at least at risk or even affected. Well, Gary, did you kind of have anything to add on there? I know we'd covered a lot of this previously in the conversation.
The only thing I've got to add just goes back to something Pascal said about updates on devices, and I completely agree with what he's saying. Update your devices. Always keep an eye out for alerts and alarms that are out there. Subscribe to things like the Register and Spiceworks and stuff like that, because sooner or later you are going to see a notification appear somewhere. Hey, like the MikroTik thing. I think it was actually on Spiceworks where there was an article that said, hey, these have been attacked. But Pascal makes a really good point. There needs to be an easier way to update these devices. We shouldn't find out only after someone's posted a forum post somewhere. And there are third-party tools out there. There are various bits and pieces out there that will go off and scan these devices and tell you. And if you can, it's worth implementing those. Spend a bit of time implementing those. Try and DDoS yourself. Try and attack yourself. Not only will you learn about how these things work, you will learn if your devices are vulnerable. And if you don't know how to do that, it is worth getting a third party in to do this and just find out where you are vulnerable, because it can be shocking. I've done this a few times in my years, and it's always shocking. You think you know about security, you think you know that your environment is secure, and then someone comes along 10 minutes later, hey, I got the screenshot of this intranet page that you host. It's like, okay, that's really scary. It only took you 10 minutes. How did you do that? There are some incredibly talented people out there, and if they want to get in, they will, and they will use any means necessary. And IoT devices, stuff like that, the routers, just make it so much easier.
Yeah, totally. Well, cool. Well, as we kind of wrap up this first part of the conversation before we get into some Q&A questions, I did want to remind everyone real quick, if you have a question for our panel, please drop it into that Q&A widget, and we'll start asking them here shortly. But I did kind of want to touch on first, before we move on, what are some potential technologies and solutions, software-wise, that are on the horizon to kind of prevent these attacks? Pascal, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so there are already platforms out there, and that is mostly geared toward the enterprises who have IoT devices that are in the field, like sensors and other devices that are hard to protect and are communicating through mobile. Those are platforms that are inherently more secure, and they try to disconnect them from the internet, although they still have touch points on the internet. The most difficult devices to actually secure are those from the consumer. Think about all the Alexas and all the cameras and all the other set-top boxes that are out there. How can we secure those? So for those, there is no silver bullet. So the only thing that we can do is make the manufacturers aware of not using default passwords. And there's actually some legislation in California that came out recently who said that starting 2020, they will not allow any IoT manufacturer with default passwords on their devices anymore. It will be illegal to sell them, basically. So they need to use unique passwords for every device. Also, this week in the UK, there was a document that came out from the UK government that said, so that put some guidelines for those IoT manufacturers to make sure that they don't use default passwords. Always use for connectivity, use encryption, use certificates, and ensure that you authenticate the endpoint and the user that is connecting to you. Whenever you put information in the cloud or information on the device, encrypt that information, because there's lots of sensitive information on those devices, especially those like children toys where children are interacting with it. There's lots of sensitive information, and you don't want your baby's face or your baby's voice to be on the internet and then publicized on YouTube or whatever, because somebody was able to penetrate an S3 bucket that was left all open on the internet. So it's a hard problem, but there are some guidelines that we can stand by and that we can use, especially from the manufacturer point of view.
Awesome. Gary, anything to add to that?
No, not really. I mean, Pascal's covered it really, really well. There's some serious horror stories out there about children's toys that have been uploading data to open databases. And as Pascal was saying earlier about Shodan, it doesn't take much to do a search on there and find these things. I think there's even a tool out there now that finds Amazon S3 buckets that are public, which is how people have been getting passwords of various companies, because they just throw them into a bucket, leave it open so that their colleagues can get access and don't realize it's accessible to the internet. So it just goes back to due diligence and scanning and checking and attacking yourself. I think attacking yourself is probably one of the best things you can do.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think that's a good kind of lead into our first Q&A question. Coming from Aaron, how do you secure CSP IoT offerings, AWS and Azure? First off, how secure do you think they are, and what steps can somebody take to better secure them? Pascal, we can start with you on that.
Yeah, so we have been looking recently a lot about cloud native applications and also those IoT devices. Now, as I said, there are platforms out there that secure IoT devices, but those are typically more for the enterprise solutions. For the other platforms where you are using Alexa and where you want to use your own skills, for example, typically what you would use is a Lambda function, so a serverless function that runs on the server. And as always, with everything that you're moving into the cloud, the attack surface of cloud services, whether that's a database like a Mongo or an S3 bucket, or that is a function that can run on demand, it's all about permissions. If you give too loose permissions, you will always be open to attacks. Now, if you look at serverless functions, and there was a very good Black Hat presentation, just in Google, just put in gone in 60 milliseconds. It's a really nice title, and it's a very entertaining presentation. But it's about a person who did research on serverless and how to hack into serverless. And actually what he came back with is serverless. For those people who don't know, serverless is actually what you do is you don't have a server anymore, but you have a function. And whenever you call onto that endpoint, into that web URL, that function will spin up immediately, process whatever arguments you're giving in through the URL and come back with an answer and then go away. So that's where the gone in 60 milliseconds come from. Typically, you will have a request, it spins up the function, searches some data, and then comes back with an answer, and then it's gone, like forever. So you cannot infect it. There is no way to try to abuse it. There's no way to look for any information. So the best way he found to attack them is by using loose permissions, a permission to jump over to storage, a permission to create a new function from there and attack from there. So everything that is in the cloud is about permissions, and we're working hard on that problem. And we will soon have some products to actually secure cloud workloads, mainly based on permissions, using the newest machine learning and AI tools that are out there to make a good posture about what permissions are actually needed, because that is something that is difficult for most people. That is, how much permission should I give? And after like a couple of years, even though that you set the permissions correctly, after a couple of months, even those permissions will get looser. Somebody adds in a user, puts in too much permission. That's your attack surface. That's the way you get attacked. Before, when we had permissions inside the data center, you could get away with too much permission because it was only insider threat that was important. Now move that workload into the cloud, and that insider threat becomes a public threat. So it's like the whole world has access to that service, and one loose permission will result into somebody actually getting into your environment and abusing it. So I think that permissions is the first thing to look at. Whenever you write a Lambda function or interact with IoT through Lambda functions, make sure that you are very strict on your permissions.
Sorry, there. Looks like I'm muted. Sorry, I had muted myself as we had a trash truck outside that was making a lot of noise. Apologies there. I was just saying I can't wait to see Nick Cage's new movie, Gone in 60 Milliseconds. I wonder what will replace the Eleanor in the IoT world. Well, Gary, did you have anything to add on that with protecting those S3 buckets and whatnot?
I think Pascal summed it up perfectly. It really is down to the permissions. When you are playing around with cloud stuff, even if you're just experimenting, trying things out, what you really need to do is make sure that you are not operating from the root account. Make sure that everyone's got their own account. Make sure it's got only the permissions that it needs. If you need things like service accounts, because I've been playing around with AWS quite a bit. AWS has this whole concept of an account that only has certain types of access and no console access. So just make sure you've got all that. Now, just going on that serverless thing, there are actually serverless functions, and I believe there's scripts out there already you can run, and it will check your internal security. It will check to see if you've got any open buckets. It's worth looking at those. It's worth running those and generating reports. Every 24 hours or so, have it run, have it send you an email if there are open buckets. And if there are open and they're supposed to be open, add them to an exception list or something like that. But for everything else, it's nice to know what's going on. It's nice to get those permissions evaluated. But yeah, it really does come down to least privilege. I mean, I think that's been said for years in the IT industry, but it's just so much more important now you've got public access and cloud and all sorts of things like that.
Yeah, totally. Well, next one coming in, kind of going to combine Connor 1368 and Mark Clayton's questions here. First off, we talked about this a little earlier, but manufacturers, obviously they're doing the best they can to keep up with security. First off, Pascal, what do you think they could do better? And then second part of that, what can our IT professionals and consumers look for in IoT devices? What security-wise, what should manufacturers be doing, and what should users be looking for?
Yeah, so there's one thing I've been asking for like for 2 years that would be important for a device. That's having a label on the box. So when people go out and shop and they see a device, like it's certified security. And I don't mean a marketing label, because we saw many vulnerabilities where actually the device in the marketing had said, oh, we are secured, we are not vulnerable to this and this. And then just 3 days later, they are top of the news because they had a major vulnerability and they were not encrypting any credentials. So we should have an independent possibility to or instance that is able to put labels on devices for consumers, so that at least consumers know, well, the device that I'm buying here, at least there has been some thought about security. Having a 100% foolproof device, well, that's utopian. You will never get to that point that your device will not be vulnerable. There will always be some way to attack it. There will always be a vulnerability in those devices, whether the platform that you're using or your own software might have some vulnerabilities. Now, I also want to address the other side of the equation, because now we've been talking about the owners of the IoT devices, but also think about the victims, because the victims are not always the owners of the devices. The owners of the devices get infected, but then those devices are used to attack other businesses and to bring down other victims, other people. So yeah, when you're the owner of device, it could be by chance that or by luck, pure luck, that you are also the victim if your device is attacking the online shop that you're trying to access. But in terms of DDoS attacks, there's this one thing. The other thing is that bots are also attacking shops to take inventory or scrape information. So botnet detection and bot management are solutions out there that are typically being used to identify the good or better humans from actual bots. And then within the bots, knowing that more than 50% of traffic that comes into websites, to online stores, is actually bot traffic, about 25% is malicious, 25% is good bots. So the good bots are the ones that index. So we need some good solutions that are able to find those 25% bad bots. And that bad bots, well, you can think about CAPTCHA, that very annoying stuff that always pops up when you need to log into a site. Now, my vision on CAPTCHA is, and I also talk a lot about AI and machine learning, some researchers found deep learning that can solve CAPTCHA with 98% accuracy, which is like twice as good as I can solve it. So actually, CAPTCHA is better at keeping out humans than it keeps out bots that are automated. So we need better solutions. And I'm sure that technologies like blockchain, for example, might be a solution where we put in an equation of trusts. So you start to create something like trust of an individual, trust of a device, and you try to communicate that trust between different parties. Now, these are just faraway technologies, but those are some of the technologies that we think might be able to solve solutions out there, or solve problems out there.
Yeah, and Gary, anything to add to that? That was pretty well covered.
That was very well covered. I do like the idea of having some sort of go-to place that has a security ranking, like 5 padlocks or something like that, so your device has been hacked or whatever it is. But I think the problem there is you're going to have these different firmware versions. So it may well be that version 1 of a device, firmware 1.0, that thing's been hacked to death, but version 2 is super secure. So you're then going to have these consumers having to teach them how to find out the firmware versions, and is it 1.1 that's okay, or is it 1.100127 or whatever it is? And it just gets more and more confusing. Even as IT pros, trying to figure some of this stuff out will lead you to a headache and several beers because it makes more sense when you're drunk, type of thing. So there needs to be something. It needs to be better. There needs to be better updating. I think we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's with what Pascal said earlier and Gary's right there. I think that's a great segue into Black Wolf's question about machine learning and AI. In the future, can we leverage machine learning and AI to become to formulate a better standard for security? And then also, would it be any quicker at creating fixes for attacks or preventing them completely? Let me start with Pascal on that.
Yeah, so now you're opening a can of worms. So, and on the AI side, we're thinking traditionally AI consists about machine learning, and within machine learning, there's one specific algorithm that makes a lot of buzz, which is deep learning. And this technology, deep learning, will for sure be the innovation that we need to be able to find the always more complex attacks that are getting out there, to be able to keep on top of the massive amount of information that we get from logs. Because as Gary said, you need to log from your device, but at some point you get so many logs that you are unable to find in all the noise the important events that are actually consisting of the attacks. So machine learning, and more specifically deep learning in that case, will be able to find some good and to make some sense in those logs. And mainly today in cybersecurity, the applications of deep learning are at the level of reducing events and finding new associations between events that you have in your company. So it's actually boiling up as attack events that need to be investigated by human experts. There's no such thing as automated mitigation using deep learning. Now, machine learning on the other side is something that we have been using for quite a long time. So machine learning are the more traditional algorithms that are more deterministic. When you look at deep learning, you look at algorithms that need to be fed a lot of data, and you're programming by data. It's like programming by example. You take a model, you put in data, and it will learn by example how it needs to react on certain new data that you present to it. When you look at traditional machine learning, those are more modeled closer to the problem. And we have been using that, for example, to find unknown attacks in DDoS, like finding out when there's a SYN attack going on, just using probability and just using different mechanics like the distribution of TCP flags to find out that you're actually under SYN attack and block it in real time. Now, going forward, whenever there's new technology in protection, that new technology gets abused by the other side of the equation, which is the attackers. So the attackers, as I said, like for my example in CAPTCHA, they're already using deep learning for breaking CAPTCHA. They're using deep learning to create more evasive malware. So they are using that deep learning, and they use what we call a generative adversarial network, which is like two deep learning networks that are pitched together against each other. And one network does the detection, the other network does the generation. You put in an executable, and the generative side will generate new malware and try to evade the second network. And it will loop automatically until it finds a malware that can evade any known antivirus on Earth, let's say, even the AI ones. And then other uses is also in social engineering. So when you think about phishing attacks, so when you have a phishing attack, and especially spear phishing, it takes a lot of effort. You need to, as an attacker, they need to take information, find information online, find the names, and then craft an email that will have more probability for the victim to be opened. Now, that can be automated using natural language processing and also using AI techniques to automate spear phishing. So it would be spear phishing at a high scale because you can attack many more targets. So for me, in the future, we will need to automate our security because attackers get more automated. And if you think that we are already overwhelmed by security events today, I would say look in 2 years and come back to this discussion. You will be more than overwhelmed.
Yeah, definitely a scary landscape when the same tools that the good guys are using, the bad guys are just as adept and versatile in using as well. Gary, anything to add to that?
Well, once again, Pascal's really covered it very well. I would love to see AI getting a bit of a boost and being used to do all sorts of testing. I mean, years ago, you had all these test harnesses where you could put software in and it would run tests you tell it to run. It would be nice if you could add some sort of AI around that can go, hey, there's all these additional tests, or I can see that there's a test here that should be run that isn't being run, and that kind of thing. And Pascal touched on a really interesting point regarding messages. A few years back, I think it was about 8 or 9 years back, we put a IDS device in front of the main core switch, and I think it was generating something like 50,000 messages an hour. There is just no way you can filter through that. It's just impossible. Even if you start filtering at what it considers severity 1 messages, that's still several thousand an hour. Are these real severity 1? Are they false alarms and this kind of stuff? We need something better than the human eye to go through this, because it's just noise right now.
Yeah, totally. Well, cool. As we kind of start to wrap this up, I think kind of a good thing to end on is this question. So apologies if I totally botched this name, but Kaishike. Probably totally wrong, but we'll go with it. So they're asking, how can you clean up a compromised device? We've talked a lot about how these devices become compromised and the threats there, but what should someone do when they discover, oh, my IoT device has been compromised? Pascal, let's start with you on that.
Yeah, that's my favorite question, actually, because the answer is so easy. It's just rebooting them. So 90%, I would even say 98% of all the botnets that we discovered in the wild were all non-persistent. The reason for that is that making something persistent on a device that has most of its file system mounted read-only is difficult and will be different for every class of device. So typically, IoT botnet herders, or the people who are designing IoT botnets out there, if we can call them designers to start with, but those people are not looking to make them persistent. And the reason for that is it's too easy to find new devices. So as you saw with Mirai, we talked about this. They are scanning, and every victim is scanning by itself. So actually, what you get is it's like an exponential infection rate that you get. Because once there's one infected, it will find another one, two infected. There's two scanning, then it becomes 4, then it becomes 8, then it becomes 16. And that's actually why every 2 minutes, if you would listen on your internet line, every 2 minutes, you see somebody trying to infect you, which is not specifically a bad thing on the internet, I would say, because that also brings me to a point that it's very much fragmented. So you have many different malicious actors out there who want to create their own botnet and use them for booter and stressors, sell them, or create some malicious attacks with them. So it's very fragmented because they are all fighting for the same limited number of resources. Although it's a big number of resources, so the biggest IoT botnets that we saw till now are like 200,000, 300,000 devices. But the potential out there is much bigger than that. So because of that, it's like a real war going on. Whenever you reboot a device, it is clean, but within 2 minutes, another botnet comes by and will reinfect it. And you will be belonging to another botnet at that point. So it's a real war of botnets out there. So to clean them, yeah, just reboot them. But at the same time, make sure that they are firewalled, disable UPnP, and so on. So once you know that you have been, or you think that you have been compromised and you want to make sure, take it out of the power, put it in a secure environment, boot it up again, and make it work from a secure environment. And you should be good to go.
Awesome. And Gary, as we start to wrap up, did you have any final thoughts on that last question, or any final thoughts that we could leave our audience with?
Well, the only things I've got to say really just mirror what Pascal has said. He's hit everything absolutely correct, completely agree with him. It really is a case of being aware that these IoT devices may not have the best security, may not have had the best care and attention, because a lot of it is about time to market, get the device out there, get it sold. And I'm sure a lot of people who are tuned into this have heard the phrase, we will fix it in phase 2. There's lots of projects out there that never get a phase 2, and you're going to have these security holes. So it is important to make sure that you do put these things on isolated VLANs, that if you do see anything suspicious, raise a ticket, investigate it, see what's going on. But also, if you do see an IoT device that does get attacked and it's got some sort of botnet on it, make sure that you check all the others that maybe have the same firmware or the same make and model and that kind of thing, just so that you've covered yourself, because you could end up almost playing whack-a-mole with these things where you fix one and then the next one gets infected or something like that. So you do have to be careful there. You do have to have monitoring on them. You really do need them in isolated lockdown VLANs, least privilege, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, definitely great. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for those thoughts and for joining us today. Pascal, any closing words that you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, no, I think that we covered most of it. Just one remark. We might be painting sometimes a dark picture, but there's still a lot of good guys who are working around the clock and who are doing threat research. So that's a good thing. And we can make sure that those IoT devices, we will find a solution for them sooner or later. Now, the only problem that we sit with today is the legacy of devices. And yeah, we cannot make sure that people throw away the old devices and replace them with new devices. That's just not going to happen. So until that happens, and until we come into an environment where people are aware of IoT and are aware of the security of IoT, I think we need to stay vigilant, as Gary said. Look at those devices, make sure that you monitor them, make sure you keep an eye on them, and try to find anomalies going out or in of your network, and keep up the good fight. That's pretty much what I think about it.
Yeah, awesome, Pascal. Well, thank you so much to both of you. This has definitely been a very engaging conversation. I know I've learned a lot. I'm not an IT pro, so hopefully our audience was able to really take away some deep learning here about how they can better protect themselves. But now, as we wrap up today's event, I did want to go ahead and announce today's winner of the 350-pound Amazon gift card. Today's winner is going to be Groovy Biscuits. So Groovy, go ahead and shoot me a PM, Matt Y, in the community, and we'll get that gift card sent to you electronically. I know you had mentioned earlier that you had some IoT devices that you had bought one of your kiddos. So hopefully this year you can maybe get them something a little better for Christmas instead of something that could be a little vulnerable. So hopefully you enjoy that. With that, everyone, I do want to thank everyone so much for tuning in today. Definitely had some great conversation, some great questions from today's audience. Special thanks to Radware for allowing us to have this conversation. Definitely want to encourage everyone to go check out Radware and the Spiceworks community, as well as their own website. If you haven't had a chance already to download or check out those handouts that they have, please open up and check out that resource list for those handouts. There's some great information in there as well. With that, everyone, I do encourage you to check out the shows that we have coming up soon by clicking on that orange button there over to your left. And with that, one final thanks to Gary and Pascal. It was great having you on today, gentlemen.
Thank you. It was great being here. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you both. It was good.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, with that, I hope everyone has a great afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. And until the next one, keep it spicy, everyone. We'll see you soon.